School Crossing by Francis King. These days it seemed as if his glasses were never clean. Yearning, importunate or mischievous, the small hands would reach out, soiling and smearing, and it was as if they soiled and smeared everything at which he looked. The garden at which he had labored for many years, the house filled with the antiques inherited from his first and now dead wife, even the youthful face of his second wife, all seemed to have lost their pristine bloom. Don't, he would ward off the hands. But the twins would think this some kind of game and, laughing hysterically, twisting and lunging, they would hurl themselves upon him. Sometimes he would be rough with them, repelling them with all his force, and then a bewilderment would suddenly freeze their half-formed features and he would see the same bewilderment on the face of their mother, as though he had all at once changed into someone else. He was always wiping the glasses. On a handkerchief. On the end of his tie. On a paper tissue or a table napkin or a sheet of lavatory paper. But the imprints of those two pairs of hands perpetually renewed themselves, just as the imprint of those twin lives now perpetually marked each hour of his existence. It must have been the glasses, the obvious explanation. The glasses and some freak of light as the late sun filtered down through a jagged line of conifers on that late autumn afternoon. It was the old drive that he knew so well, up the hill from the town. He had passed the Smuggler's Rest, with its faked creosote beams, its plastic chairs and tables set out in the hope that some hardy travelers might be tempted to eat or drink outside, its neat hedges, neat flower beds, neat paths, then the low line of red brick council houses, then the notice, glinting briefly in the setting sun, School Crossing. School, his school. Or what he had thought of as being his school until they had taken it from him. Teaching English part-time to foreigners now, he tried not to think of that brutal dispossession. Never went near the school. Never wished to see any of his former colleagues, unless a little furtive, a little guilty, a little shame-faced, they themselves sought him out. Never spoke about it, not even to Claire, the young science teacher whom he had married. School Crossing. The Aston Martin, which he could no longer afford to run, leaped effortlessly up the hill, and suddenly, for a moment, there they were, boys and girls straggling across the road. Faces turned at the sound of the engine. Some drew back, others scuttled over to the further side, jostling, ungainly, undignified. But why should they be out of school as early as this? School holiday? No. He had braked to a halt. And then, to his amazement, he had seen that there was no one there at all. The late sun glinted on the crown of the road, the conifers soared up on either side, their green encrusted here and there near their summits with rust, somewhere far off an owl hooted. Odd. He could have sworn. But it was the glasses, of course. He took them off, fumbled in his pocket for a handkerchief, found he had none and then, as so often, used the end of his tie. The tie seemed only to make them worse, leaving a halo over the left lens where before there had only been a streak. The sun sank with a strange abruptness, as though that patch of fire on the crown of the road had been doused with an invisible pail of water. Behind him a van was hooting. He looked in the mirror and saw that the driver looked like that Mason boy, son of a butcher, who had been one of the ringleaders. But he wasn't going to think of the school, never, ever. He engaged the gears and the car leapt forward, like some beast suddenly unleashed to seize its prey. Odd. He did not tell Claire. One of the twins, the boy, had grazed his knee in a fall, and the other twin, the girl, had somehow contrived to break a Crown Derby cup. He had to hear about both accidents and he had to pretend that he cared more about the knee than the cup. Would he have mentioned what had happened on the hill if he had come home to peace instead of turmoil? He did not know. Probably not. There was a lot that he never mentioned to Claire, a whole secret life of hurt feelings, humiliation, disappointment and resentment. She herself was so candid, telling him all her most intimate thoughts and feelings, that she could not guess at the depth of his lack of candor. A good day, Mark. Oh, not too bad. Not too bad. He had picked up the Times, but as he was opening it, the boy twin began to scramble up onto his knees. One hand went out, crushing the paper. A shoe kicked his shin. Then the other hand was at his glasses. The child crowed with pleasure. Mark wanted to fling him from him. But instead he forced himself to laugh as he held the child's arms, one in either hand, and asked him, "Well, how is that knee of yours?" Again the child tried to lunge, but his father held him firm. Then the girl came up from behind and her greasy fingers. He looked across at Claire and he could hardly see her face. The smears seemed to be across it, not on his glasses. "Oh, do take the children upstairs or into the kitchen or somewhere." She got up silently and again he fumbled for the handkerchief that he had not got and again he raised the end of his tie. Several days passed before it happened again. Now it was dark and he was returning from a farewell party given by a group of jolly, noisy students from Norway. They had kept filling his glass even though he told them, "Look, I've got to drive home. I don't want to be breathalyzed, now do I?" He felt old and tired, a sour envy had invaded him, like the aftertaste of the acid Spanish wine, for the youth not merely of the students but also of his colleagues. He wondered how soon he could decently make his escape. A plump coquettish girl, with a downy moon face and eyes of an arctic blankness and blueness, she had always sat just under his desk, arriving at class long before anyone else in order to secure that place, had swayed up to him and inquired tipsily, "You do not dance, Professor?" "My dancing days are over." "But you will dance with me?" "A last dance?" He shook his head. He forced himself to smile. "Neither a last dance nor a first dance. Not after all these years. Not even with you, my dear." Surprisingly she had seemed not to be angered but delighted by the rebuff. It was what she must have expected. She laughed, throwing back her head and showing large, white, even teeth. Then she told the others, "Professor Clark says that his dancing days are over. He will not dance with me." "Shame," cried one of Mark's colleagues, a spotty boy whom he particularly disliked. "Oh, come along, Mark," another colleague, a girl, cajoled him, taking him by an arm and attempting to drag him among the dancers. He had never asked her to call him Mark and he always tried to avoid calling her by any name, surname or Christian name. Some of the students began to clap her as she tugged and tugged at him, her face growing red under its swaying fringe of jet hair. But he would not yield. "No, I'm not going to dance. But you can give me something more to drink." A Norwegian boy splashed some more of the vinegary white wine into his glass. Well, it could have been that wine. Because he had been a little drunk as he had walked out, long before any other of the teachers, into the frosty December air. He had dropped the car keys and he had felt uncomfortably top-heavy as he had searched over the asphalt of the yard for them, the tips of his fingers grazing themselves on its uneven surfaces. It must have been that wine and not his glasses, because as soon as he had got into the car, he took off the glasses and wiped them on a corner of a handkerchief that was still neatly folded in the trouser pocket in which he had put it before setting out. Yes, it must have been that wine. What else could it have been? It was misty as he drove up the hill and he passed only one car, crawling beetle-like ahead of him. He liked that surge of power as the Aston Martin devoured the little Fiat or whatever it was. It gave him a feeling of exhilaration, it never failed to do so. Which was why he had kept the car while at the same time urging on Claire a number of economies. The daily, holidays abroad, drinks before dinner, the laundry for his shirts, all must go before that car would go. Now that his joints so often ached and were stiff with rheumatism in the mornings, now that he found himself out of breath at the top of a hill or even of the stairs, now that one set of tennis, one swim, one orgasm, was enough for him, he found a compensation in the undiminished ferocity and pounce of that engine. He could not see the crests of the conifers because of that pervading mist. At times he could hardly see the sides of the road as it curved up to the brow of the hill. The trees seemed to have merged into huddled, opaque masses as the fierce headlights picked them out. School crossing. The cat's eyes winked at him and then died as he raced past. Slam on the brakes. Their terrified faces. Some began to run. Others frozen. The tires screeched. The car all but went out of control. He peered into the mist, the car door half open and one leg hanging through it into the icy air. He had been about to rush out and shout at them. "You bloody clots! Couldn't you hear my engine? Didn't you see my lights? And what are you all doing at an hour like this? Don't tell me that you're coming home from school. You might have got yourselves killed." But there was no one there at all, no target at which to direct his near-hysterical shock and rage. He heard a chug-chug-chug behind him and the little beetle crawled up past the sign, slowed, all but stopped and then passed on. The driver was probably saying to himself, "Odd. Why should he have stopped there? Alone too. But he seems all right. Better not to get mixed up in whatever it is. Perhaps he just wants a piss." The silence closed round the coughing of the little engine as it disappeared from view. He raised the end of his tie, took off his glasses. But of course it had been the wine, it must have been the wine. After that he began to dread having to pass the notice. But there was no other way to drive up from the town to the house, not, that is, unless he made an enormous detour. Enormous and costly too, that car devoured petrol with the same greed that it devoured the distance between itself and any other car. It was some silly kind of optical illusion. The trees with the sun low behind them or with the headlights thrust against them. Some trick of shadow. And the fact that he was tired, the glasses, the wine. Nothing odd about it really. As a child, waking up and seeing what seemed to be a stranger seated in the chair, a dark, hump stranger, with a white luminous face, he had screamed and screamed and screamed, but all it was, his mother rushing in, was his own clothes with the moonlight on them. Silly. She had said that to him. Silly, silly boy. Why, it's nothing. It was nothing. But still the dread remained. As the Aston Martin climbed effortlessly up the hill, he would feel his mouth go dry, his heart would start to thump and he would peer ahead, wondering, would it happen again this time? But days passed and it did not happen, and soon that tension of both the body and the brain no longer gripped him. He had still not spoken of what had happened to Claire or anyone else, and now he would not do so, since obviously it was not going to happen again. Going into the town one Saturday to shop, they left the two children for a moment in the locked car while they changed their books at the library. It had been a day of nagging rain, and when they returned, they found that the seats of the car, its sides and even its roof were imprinted with the marks of small muddy feet. He could understand how, without meaning it, they might have soiled the seats by scrambling over them or even the sides by kicking out, but to reach the roof they must have made a deliberate, malicious effort. Christ! What the hell have you been doing? Look at this. Look! Look! He pointed here and here and here, and the twins cowered and giggled, while Claire, in an effort to placate him, her face suddenly pinched and gray with apprehension, pulled a tiny, pathetic wad of a handkerchief out of her handbag and began to make ineffectual efforts to wipe away the mess. "You'll only smear it. Leave it. I'll see to it when I get home. It'll all come out. You'll see." As so often, her fear of him made her turn on the twins. "Oh, stop that silly sniggering. Why can't you control these bloody brats? They're your brats too." But somehow, deep inside himself, he never thought of them as his brats at all. They had come too late, and they had come unwanted. Claire took the girl on her lap, leaving the boy in the back of the car. The boy was her favorite, and so it was the girl to whom she gave this kind of preferential treatment. "Look, pet. I've got this lovely book for you. Look. That's a dog like the one that Anne has got, isn't it? A big dog, with a big bushy tail. And big teeth. But a friendly dog. Like Anna's dog. A dog with long, long ears." From time to time she would glance sideways at him with wary apprehension, wondering whether he would forget about the stains all over the interior of the car or whether they would make him difficult for the whole weekend. He drove thinking, "Christ, what inanities." The car seemed even smoother and even more powerful than ever, and that began to soothe him, as he pushed it up the steeper and steeper gradient, passing one car after another. Everyone seemed to have been shopping. Every car was laden with children and baskets and carrier bags and dogs and toys. School crossing. There was a ramshackle saloon ahead of him, just beyond the notice, and then, as he pressed the accelerator to catch it up too and leave it in his conquering wake, suddenly, without any warning, the children began to stream across the road. In twos and threes. Shouting to each other. Laughing. One boy pushing another boy into a tall, solitary girl. The impact of the braking threw the boy twin forward so that he struck his forehead on the seat in front. Fortunately Mark and Claire had both fastened their safety belts, and the girl was secure in Claire's hands. The boy began to whimper, rubbing his forehead with a look of bewilderment on a face that had begun to pucker. Cars passed, the cars that they themselves had passed. Faces looked round. What a bloody silly place to stop. That's the way to cause an accident. Idiot. Someone hooted. "Are you all right, darling?" The child began to wail. Claire touched the spot with blunt, cool fingers. "Does it hurt?" The child wailed louder. "He's not hurt. You know how he always makes a fuss over the smallest things. He could have been hurt. Badly. What on earth did you stop like that for? Didn't you see?" He broke off. "See? See what?" He thought quickly. "The hedgehog. Hedgehog? In the middle of the road. I was afraid I'd run over it. I saw nothing. I saw it, Mummy. I saw it," the girl began to shout. "I saw it. Big, big hedgehog." The boy was sobbing now. Claire said to the girl, "You'd better climb over to the back and change places." "Why?" "Because he's hurt his forehead." "No. Now, Sally, do what I tell you. It's my turn to sit in front. You sat in front last time. Didn't. Did, oh Christ." It was with a cold, murderous rage that he engaged the gears and once more resumed the journey home. Would they never allow him any peace? Such was his fury against them that he hardly thought of those phantoms suddenly emerging out into the road. It was only later that he began to worry. Bill Edmonds, Big Bill as he was known all over the town to differentiate him from his partner, also Bill, who was small and fox-like, had once been Mark's closest friend as well as his doctor. Perhaps he still imagined that he was Mark's closest friend, since he was not particularly perceptive, but Mark had never felt the same towards Bill since that whole school business. Bill had not been loyal, or at least not loyal enough to say, "My friend," right or wrong. His view that Mark had been partly wrong he had never concealed from him, even though he had conceded that Mark had also been partly right. You can't run a comprehensive as though it were a small and select grammar school. You know exactly what you're doing, and a lot of that staff of yours have no idea what they're doing at all. But that doesn't mean that you can ride roughshod over them. Later, when the affair had smashed Mark's career and smashed so much else, it had also smashed the peculiar intimacy that had joined the two men. They went on seeing each other. Bill went on prescribing drugs for Mark's blood pressure, his insomnia and hay fever. Mark went on tutoring Bill's bored, backward daughter in mathematics during the vacations. The two couples went on entertaining each other to dinner and going on holidays together and playing tennis with each other. But, as far as Mark at least was concerned, the friendship had ended. Now Bill said, "Well, I'm damned if I can find anything wrong with you. The blood pressure's a little lower, in fact. The heart is fine. I must have imagined it." A statement more than a question. Bill shrugged. "Some trick of the light," he said. "I've thought of that. But it's happened at different times of the day. I mean, if it was a trick of the light, then if the light then changed, if it was coming from a different direction or a different source. Your guess is as good as mine. I suppose one might call it a hallucination." "Well." Bill laughed, one massive buttock perched on the edge of the desk while he scratched at the other. He was always scratching himself. Mark stared down at his linked hands and then darted an upward look. "You don't think? Well, this isn't the beginning of a breakdown, is it?" "Christ, no. I'd be much more worried if you were hallucinating all over the place at all times of the day. The fact that it's just that one particular spot and just that one particular hallucination. But, in any case," he added hurriedly, "hallucination is not really the word for something so trivial." "Then what is?" Bill did not answer that. "You've been through a difficult time. Months ago, I know. But the after effects of that kind of traumatic experience are often delayed. I should guess that you're a bit run down. Liable to get depressed. Tired. Well, those children certainly never let me sleep after 6 or 7. Let me give you a tranquilizer. When Mark's first wife had been dying, Bill had also given her a tranquilizer, since there was nothing else to give her. A happiness pill, he had called it to Mark, and certainly, whether because of her faith or because of that pill, she had died reasonably happy, when not in pain. "Oh, I don't think. Now come on. Half my patients are on tranquilizers. Nothing to it." Mark had the prescription made up, but he pushed the bottle into the back of a drawer and forgot about it. The hallucination, if it was a hallucination, now came more and more frequently until it was happening almost every day. As he stepped into the car, sometimes even during his class, he would ask himself, "I wonder if I'll see them today." They even appeared when he was giving another of the teachers, whose motorcycle had broken down, a lift up the hill. There they were ahead of him. He had purposely slowed the car, just in case, straggling out over the road with their briefcases, trailing scarves, knee-high boots and loads of books. He could hear their loud immature voices and hear their loud immature laughter over the purr of the engine. He stopped and watched them, oblivious of his passenger. As they crossed over from the footpath to the lane on the other side. Some of the faces he had never seen before, they had come to the school since his day. Others he recognized and those he hated. Anything the matter? What? The last of them had gone. He attempted to pull himself together. "I was looking at that owl in the tree over there. He's often there at this hour. You must have the most fantastic sight. I can hardly see a thing. It's as though he waited for me. Every evening." Well, imagine that. Mark released the handbrake. Suddenly he felt the sweat icy on his forehead, on his neck and in the small of his back. He and the famous ophthalmologist had been at the same Oxford college together, but there had always been a faint condescension even then from the spectacularly gifted man to the one far less gifted, and now it had grown more marked. The ophthalmologist, thin and sharply handsome, with his modish clothes and his modish haircut, might have been at least 10 years younger than the schoolmaster. Fancy deciding to start a family so late in life. I'd no idea. It's as though I'd suddenly decided to get married. Well, we didn't really decide to start a family. It just happened. Still, it must be fun. Up to a point. I don't really care for children myself. Or animals. Mark nearly said, neither do I. But some impulse of loyalty to Claire, not to the twins, restrained him from doing so. Which must mean that I have a shocking character, the ophthalmologist went on, obviously not believing anything of the kind. When he had finished his examination he said, "Well, I can't find anything amiss." Mark did not care for the emphasis on the pronoun. Who did he think could find anything? A psychiatrist? The eyes are perfectly normal for a man of your age. In fact, I don't think I'd have even prescribed those glasses for you. You could easily do without them. Then what? The other man shrugged. You might have floaters. People with short sight often do. They're maddening things and, if you start to think about them, to become too conscious of them, they can cause you a lot of misery. I had a patient once, a woman, who even advertised in the Times for a cure for them. But there isn't one, of course. As I'd told her. I've had floaters. I know what you mean. But they could hardly account for my seeing a number of school children and seeing them in detail. Could it? The ophthalmologist, who wanted to get home before going on to Covent Garden, sighed and shrugged. You might be hemorrhaging slightly from the eyes from time to time. Though I see no evidence of it. I've often thought that that's all that Joan of Arc's visions amounted to. She never menstruated, you know. But she might have bled instead from the tissue of the eye. It's not unknown. Not at all. I had a woman patient who did precisely that. You don't suggest that I'm menstruating from my eyes? The two men laughed, but Mark's laughter was nervous and strained. Good God, no. And in any case, you'd have reached the menopause by now and the bleeding would be over. Again they both laughed. The ophthalmologist put his arm around Mark's shoulder. It was as a patient that he thought of him now, not as a friend, and the gesture was a purely professional one. I should guess you need a holiday. You look rather strained. You've aged a bit since that last gaudy. Why not go away for a holiday? I might do that. I should ignore the whole thing. Drive through your vision. Why not? Prove to yourself that there's nothing there at all. Yes. The ophthalmologist realized that, so far from encouraging his patient, he had only discouraged him further. Mark had left his car in the station car park. When he went to reclaim it there, he found two schoolboys examining it carefully. These schoolboys were not from the comprehensive but from the posh preparatory school a few miles outside the town. Mark knew that from their caps. That's a lovely job you've got there. Super. Fantastic. Mark put his key in the door, smiling at them, saying nothing. He felt that somehow he must appease them. Must cost a fortune to run. What's the fastest you've done? Oh, I've no idea. But she's fast. I bet she is. They hung around, probably they wanted him to offer them a ride. But he did not do so. He slammed the door and thought, you're like those others. Just like those others. Except that you wear those caps and you sleep in dormitories instead of at home and you have that disdainful upper-class drawl. I hate the lot of you. It was you who smashed me. Smashed me. He drove off, not even bothering to look at them again. It was a beautiful December afternoon. He ought to have been happy at the thought of going home after a day in a London that seemed to him, with each visit, to become more and more noisy, more and more crowded, more and more squalid. But he was not happy. He thought of that lucky ophthalmologist, who had been wise enough not to burden himself with a wife and children, who had visited the Caribbean for his last holiday and was going to visit East Africa for his next, who had been about to go to Covent Garden to see Traviata. Back home, Claire would complain that the dishwasher had broken down again or that a bulb needed replacing. The children would have broken something or lost something or soiled something. The stain would still be in the center of the sitting room carpet. The seat of the chair on the left of the fireplace would still be sagging. He would still be able to see where Claire had stuck that Crown Derby cup inexpertly together. The Aston Martin began to leap up the hill. Would they be there, waiting for him among the trees? In a curious way, he felt that his fragile, failing body was now somehow fused with the strong, ever-powerful one of the car. I should ignore the whole thing. Drive through your vision, why not? Prove to yourself that there's nothing there at all. What's the fastest you've done in it? Well, I'm doing over 70 now and on a gradient like this. Lovely job. Super. Fantastic. His heart was now the throbbing heart of the engine, his nerves trilled with each of the explosions that sent it hurtling onwards. School crossing. I should ignore the whole thing. The impact was terrible. The car plowed on and on. Then at last it jolted to a stop. Staring out ahead of him, he thought, this must be what is meant by seeing red. The whole windscreen was smeared with blood. Or were the smears only on his glasses? Next story. A psychological experiment by Richard Marsh. The conversation had been of murders and of suicides. It had almost seemed as if each speaker had felt constrained to cap the preceding speaker's tale of horror. As the talk went on, Mr. Howitt had drawn farther and farther into a corner of the room, as if the subject were little to his liking. Now that all the speakers but one had quitted the smoking room, he came forward from his corner, in the hope, possibly, that with this last remaining individual, who, like himself, had been a silent listener, he might find himself in more congenial society. Dreadful stuff those fellows have been talking. Mr. Howitt was thin and he was tall. He seemed shorter than he really was, owing to what might be described as a persistent cringe rather than a stoop. He had a deferential, almost frightened air. His pallid face was lighted by a smile which one felt might, in a moment, change into a stare of terror. He rubbed his hands together softly, as if suffering from a chronic attack of nerves. He kept giving furtive glances round the room. In reply to Mr. Howitt's observation, the stranger nodded his head. There was something in the gesture, and indeed in the man's whole appearance, which caused Mr. Howitt to regard him more attentively. The stranger's size was monstrous. By him on the table was a curious-looking box, about 18 inches square, painted in hideously alternating stripes of blue and green and yellow, and although it was spring, and the smoking room was warm, he wore his overcoat and a soft felt hat. So far as one could judge from his appearance, seated, he was at least 6 feet in height. As to girth, his dimensions were bewildering. One could only guess wildly at his weight. To add to the peculiarity of his appearance, he wore a huge black beard, which not only hung over his chest, but grew so high up his cheeks as almost to conceal his eyes. Mr. Howitt took the chair which was in front of the stranger. His eyes were never for a moment still, resting, as they passed, upon the bearded giant in front of him, then flashing quickly hither and thither about the room. "Do you stay in Jersey long?" "No," the reply was monosyllabic, but, though it was heard so briefly, at the sound of the stranger's voice Mr. Howitt half rose, grasped the arm of his chair, and gasped. The stranger seemed surprised. "What's the matter?" Mr. Howitt dropped back onto his seat. He took out his handkerchief to wipe his forehead. His smile, which had changed into a stare of terror on its reappearance, assumed a sickly hue. "Nothing. Only a curious similarity." "Similarity? What do you mean?" Whatever Mr. Howitt might mean, every time the stranger opened his mouth it seemed to give him another shock. It was a moment or two before he regained sufficient control over himself to enable him to answer. "Your voice reminds me of one which I used to hear. It's a mere fugitive resemblance." "Whose voice does mine remind you of?" "A friend's." "What was his name?" "His name was Cookson." Mr. Howitt spoke with a perceptible stammer. "Cookson. I see." There was silence. For some cause, Mr. Howitt seemed on a sudden to have gone all limp. He sat in a sort of heap on his chair. He smoothed his hands together, as if with unconscious volition. His sickly smile had degenerated into a fatuous grin. His shifty eyes kept recurring to the stranger's face in front of him. It was the stranger who was the next to speak. "Did you hear what those men were talking about?" "Yes." "They were talking of murders." "Yes. I heard rather a curious story of a murder as I came down to Weymouth in the train. It's a sort of talk I do not care for." "No. Perhaps not, but this was rather a singular tale. It was about a murder which took place the other day at Exeter." Mr. Howitt started. "At Exeter?" "Yes, at Exeter." The stranger stood up. As he did so, one realized how grotesquely unwieldy was his bulk. It seemed to be as much as he could do to move. The 3 pockets in the front of his overcoat were protected by buttoned flaps. He undid the buttons. As he did so, the flaps began to move. Something peeped out. Then hideous things began to creep from his pockets: efts, newts, lizards, various crawling creatures. Mr. Howitt's eyes ceased to stray. They were fastened on the crawling creatures. The hideous things wriggled and writhed in all directions over the stranger. The huge man gave himself a shake. They all fell from him to the floor. They lay for a second as if stupefied by the fall. Then they began to move to all 4 quarters of the room. Mr. Howitt drew his legs under his chair. "Pretty creatures, aren't they?" said the stranger. "I like to carry them about with me wherever I go. Don't let them touch you. Some of them are nasty if they bite." Mr. Howitt tucked his long legs still further under his chair. He regarded the creatures which were wriggling on the floor with a degree of aversion which was painful to witness. The stranger went on. "About this murder at Exeter, which I was speaking of. It was a case of 2 solicitors who occupied offices together on Fore Street Hill." Mr. Howitt glanced up at the stranger, then back again at the writhing newts. He rather gasped than spoke. "Fore Street Hill?" "Yes, they were partners. The name of one of them was Rault, Andrew Rault. By the way, I like to know with whom I am talking. May I inquire what your name is?" This time Mr. Howitt was staring at the stranger with wide-open eyes, momentarily forgetful even of the creatures which were actually crawling beneath his chair. He stammered and he stuttered. "My name's Howitt. You'll see it in the hotel register." "Howitt? I see. I'm glad I have met you, Mr. Howitt. It seems that this man, Andrew Rault, murdered his partner, a man named Douglas Colston." Mr. Howitt was altogether oblivious of the things upon the floor. He clutched at the arms of his chair. His voice was shrill. "Murdered? How do they know he murdered him? It seems they have some shrewd ideas upon the point, from this." The stranger took from an inner pocket of his overcoat what proved, when he had unfolded it, to be a double-crown poster. He held it up in front of Mr. Howitt. It was headed in large letters, "Murder, £100 reward." "You see, they are offering £100 reward for the apprehension of this man, Andrew Rault. That looks as if someone had suspicions. Here is his description: tall, thin, stoops, has sandy hair, thin on top, parted in the middle, restless gray eyes, wide mouth, bad teeth, thin lips, white face, speaks in a low, soft voice, has a nervous trick of rubbing his hands together. The stranger ceased reading from the placard to look at Mr. Howitt. "Are you aware, sir, that this description is very much like you?" Mr. Howitt's eyes were riveted on the placard. They had followed the stranger as he read. His manner was feverishly strained. "It's not. Nothing of the sort. It's your imagination. It's not in the least like me. Pardon me, but the more I look at you the more clearly I perceive how strong is the resemblance. It is you to the life." As a detective, he paused. Mr. Howitt held his breath. "I mean, supposing I were a detective, which I am not." He paused again. Mr. Howitt gave a gasp of relief. "I should feel almost justified in arresting you and claiming the reward. You are so made in the likeness of Andrew Rault." "I'm not. I deny it. It's a lie." Mr. Howitt stood up. His voice rose to a shriek. A fit of trembling came over him. It constrained him to sit down again. The stranger seemed amused. "My dear sir, I entreat you to be calm. I was not suggesting for one moment that you had any actual connection with the miscreant Rault. The resemblance must be accidental. Did you not tell me your name was Howitt?" "Yes, that's my name, Howitt, William Howitt." "Any relation to the poet?" "Poet?" Mr. Howitt seemed mystified. Then, to make a dash at it, "Yes, my great-uncle." "I congratulate you, Mr. Howitt, on your relationship. I have always been a great admirer of your great-uncle's works. Perhaps I had better put this poster away. It may be useful for future reference." The stranger, folding up the placard, replaced it in his pocket. With a quick movement of his fingers he did something which detached what had seemed to be the inner lining of his overcoat from the coat itself. Splitting the garment, as it were, and making it into two. As he did so, there fell from all sides of him another horde of crawling creatures. They dropped like lumps of jelly onto the floor, and remained for some seconds, a wriggling mass. Then, like their forerunners, they began to make incursions towards all the points of the compass. Mr. Howitt, already in a condition of considerable agitation, stared at these ungainly forms in a state of mind which seemed to approach to stupefaction. "More of my pretty things, you perceive. I'm very fond of reptiles. I always have been. Don't allow any of them to touch you. They might do you an injury. Reptiles sometimes do." He turned a little away from Mr. Howitt. "I heard some particulars of this affair at Exeter. It seems that these two men, Rault and Colston, were not only partners in the profession of the law, they were also partners in the profession of swindling. Thorough-paced rogues, both of them. Unfortunately, there is not a doubt of it. But it appears that the man Rault was not only false to the world at large, he was false even to his partner. Don't you think, Mr. Howitt, that it is odd that a man should be false to his partner?" The inquiry was unheeded. Mr. Howitt was gazing at the crawling creatures which seemed to be clustering about his chair. "Ring the bell," he gasped. "Ring the bell. Have them taken away." "Have what taken away?" "My pretty playthings." "My dear sir, to touch them would be dangerous. If you are very careful not to move from your seat, I think I may guarantee that you will be safe. You did not notice my question. Don't you think it odd that a man should be false to his partner?" "Oh. Yes, very." The stranger eyed the other intently. There was something in Mr. Howitt's demeanor which, to say the least of it, was singular. "I thought you would think it was odd. It appears that one night the two men agreed that they would divide spoils. They proceeded to do so then and there. Colston, wholly unsuspicious of evil, was seated at a table, making up a partnership account. Rault, stealing up behind him, stupefied him with chloroform. It wasn't chloroform. Not chloroform. May I ask how you know? I guessed it. For a stranger, rather a curious subject on which to hazard a guess, don't you think so? However, allowing your guess, we will say it was not chloroform. Whatever it was, it stupefied Colston. Rault, when he perceived Colston was senseless, produced a knife, like this. The stranger flourished in the air a big steel blade, which was shaped like a hunting knife. As he did so, throwing his overcoat from him onto the floor, he turned right round towards Mr. Howitt. Mr. Howitt stared at him voiceless. It was not so much at the sufficiently ugly weapon he was holding in his hand at which he stared, as at the man himself. The stranger, indeed, presented an extraordinary spectacle. The upper portion of his body was enveloped in some sort of oilskin, such as sailors wear in dirty weather. The oilskin was inflated to such an extent that the upper half of him resembled nothing so much as a huge ill-shaped bladder. That it was inflated was evident, with something, too, that was conspicuously alive. The oilskin writhed and twisted, surged and heaved, in a fashion that was anything but pleasant to behold. You look at me. See here. The stranger dashed the knife he held into his own breast, or he seemed to. He cut the oilskin open from top to bottom. And there gushed forth, not his heart's blood, but an amazing mass of hissing, struggling, twisting serpents. They fell, all sorts and sizes, in a confused, furious, frenzied heap, upon the floor. In a moment the room seemed to be alive with snakes. They dashed hither and thither, in and out, round and round, in search either of refuge or revenge. And, as the snakes came on, the efts, the newts, the lizards, and the other creeping things, in their desire to escape them, crawled up the curtains, and the doors, and the walls. Mr. Howitt gave utterance to a sort of strangled exclamation. He retained sufficient presence of mind to spring upon the seat of his chair, and to sit upon the back of it. The stranger remained standing, apparently wholly unmoved, in the midst of the seeming pandemonium of creepy things. Do you not like snakes, Mr. Howitt? I do. They appeal to me strongly. This is part of my collection. I rather pride myself on the ingenuity of the contrivance which enables me to carry my pets about with me wherever I may go. At the same time you are wise in removing your feet from the floor. Not all of them are poisonous. Possibly the more poisonous ones may not be able to reach you where you are. You see this knife? The stranger extended it towards Mr. Howitt. This is the knife with which, when he had stupefied him, Andrew Rault slashed Douglas Colston about the head and face and throat like this. The removal of his overcoat, and, still more, the vomiting forth of the nest of serpents, had decreased the stranger's bulk by more than one half. Disembarrassing himself of the remnants of his oilskins, he removed his soft felt hat, and, tearing off his huge black beard, stood revealed as a tall, upstanding, muscularly built man, whose head and face and neck were almost entirely concealed by strips of plaster, which crossed and recrossed each other in all possible and impossible directions. There was silence. The two men stared at each other. With a gasp Mr. Howitt found his voice. Douglas. Andrew. I thought you were dead. I am risen from the grave. I am glad you are not dead. Why? Mr. Howitt paused as if to moisten his parched lips. I never meant to kill you. In that case, Andrew, your meaning was unfortunate. I do mean to kill you, now. Don't kill me, Douglas. A reason, Andrew. If you knew what I have suffered since I thought I had killed you, you would not wish to take upon yourself the burden which I have had to bear. My nerves, Andrew, are stronger than yours. What would crush you to the ground would not weigh on me at all. Surely you knew that before. Mr. Howitt fidgeted on the back of his chair. It was not that you did not mean to kill me. You lacked the courage. You gashed me like some frenzied cur. Then, afraid of your own handiwork, you ran to save your skin. You dared not wait to see if what you had meant to do was done. Why, Andrew, as soon as the effects of your drug had gone, I sat up. I heard you running down the stairs, I saw your knife lying at my side, all stained with my own blood. See, Andrew, the stains are on it still. I even picked up this scrap of paper which had fallen from your pocket onto the floor. He held out a piece of paper towards Mr. Howitt. It is the advertisement of an hotel, Hotel de la Couronne d'Or, St. Heliers, Jersey. I said to myself, I wonder if that is where Andrew is gone. I will go and see. And if I find him I will kill him. I have found you, and behold, your heart has so melted within you that already you feel something of the pangs of death. Mr. Howitt did seem to be more dead than alive. His face was bloodless. He was shivering as if with cold. These melodramatic and, indeed, slightly absurd details, the stranger waved his hand towards the efts, and newts, and snakes, and lizards, were planned for your especial benefit. I was aware what a horror you had of creeping things. I take it, it is constitutional. I knew I had but to spring on you half a bushel or so of reptiles, and all the little courage you ever had would vanish. As it has done. The stranger stopped. He looked, with evident enjoyment of his misery, at the miserable creature squatted on the back of the chair in front of him. Mr. Howitt tried to speak. 2 or 3 times he opened his mouth, but there came forth no sound. At last he said, in curiously husky tones, Douglas. Andrew. If you do it they are sure to have you. It is not easy to get away from Jersey. How kind of you, Andrew, and how thoughtful. But you might have spared yourself your thought. I have arranged all that. There is a cattle boat leaves for St. Malo in half an hour on the tide. You will be dead in less than half an hour, so I go in that. Again there were movements of Mr. Howitt's lips. But no words were audible. The stranger continued. The question which I have had to ask myself has been, how shall I kill you? I might kill you with the knife with which you endeavored to kill me. As he spoke, he tested the keenness of the blade with his fingers. With it I might slit your throat from ear to ear, or I might use it in 100 different ways. Or I might shoot you like a dog. Producing a revolver, he pointed it at Mr. Howitt's head. Sit quite still, Andrew, or I may be tempted to flatten your nose with a bullet. You know I can shoot straight. Or I might avail myself of this. Still keeping the revolver pointed at Mr. Howitt's head, he took from his waistcoat pocket a small syringe. This, Andrew, is a hypodermic syringe. I have but to take firm hold of you, thrust the point into one of the blood vessels of your neck, and inject the contents. You will at once endure exquisite tortures which, after 2 or 3 minutes, which will seem to you like centuries, will result in death. But I have resolved to do myself, and you, this service, with neither of the 3. Again the stranger stopped. This time Mr. Howitt made no attempt to speak. He was not a pleasant object to contemplate. As the other had said, to judge from his appearance he already seemed to be suffering some of the pangs of death. All the manhood had gone from him. Only the shell of what was meant to be a man remained. The exhibition of his pitiful cowardice afforded his whilom partner unqualified pleasure. Have you ever heard of an author named De Quincey? He wrote on murder, considered as a fine art. It is as a fine art I have had to consider it. In that connection I have had to consider 3 things. 1. That you must be killed. 2. That you must be killed in such a manner that you shall suffer the greatest possible amount of pain. 3. And not the least essential, that you must be killed in such a manner that under no circumstances can I be found guilty of having caused your death. I have given these 3 points my careful consideration, and I think that I have been able to find something which will satisfy all the requirements. That something is in this box." The stranger went to the box which was on the table, the square box which had, as ornamentation, the hideously alternating stripes of blue and green and yellow. He rapped on it with his knuckles. As he did so, from within it there came a peculiar sound like a sullen murmur. "You hear? It is death calling to you from the box. It awaits its prey. It bids you come." He struck the box a little bit harder. There proceeded from it, as if responsive to his touch, what seemed to be a series of sharp and angry screeches. Again. It loses patience. It grows angry. It bids you hasten. Ah! He brought his hand down heavily upon the top of the box. Immediately the room was filled with a discord of sounds, cries, yelpings, screams, snarls, the tumult dying away in what seemed to be an intermittent, sullen roaring. The noise served to rouse the snakes, and efts, and lizards to renewed activity. The room seemed again to be alive with them. As he listened, Mr. Howitt became livid. He was, apparently, becoming imbecile with terror. His aforetime partner, turning to him, pointed to the box with outstretched hand. "What a row it makes! What a rage it's in! Your death screams out to you, with a ravening longing, the most awful death that a man can die. Andrew, to die! And such a death as this!" Again he struck the box. Again there came from it that dreadful discord. "Stand up!" Mr. Howitt looked at him, as a drivelling idiot might look at a keeper whom he fears. It seemed as if he made an effort to frame his lips for the utterance of speech. But he had lost the control of his muscles. With every fibre of his being he seemed to make a dumb appeal for mercy to the man in front of him. The appeal was made in vain. The command was repeated. "Get off your chair, and stand upon the floor." Like some trembling automaton Mr. Howitt did as he was told. He stood there like some lunatic deaf-mute. It seemed as if he could not move, save at the bidding of his master. That master was careful not to loosen, by so much as a hair's breadth, the hold he had of him. I now proceed to put into execution the most exquisite part of my whole scheme. Were I to unfasten the box and let death loose upon you, some time or other it might come out, these things do come out at times, and it might then appear that the deed had, after all, been mine. I would avoid such risks. So you shall be your own slayer, Andrew. You shall yourself unloose the box, and you shall yourself give death its freedom, so that it may work on you its will. The most awful death that a man can die. Come to me, here. And the man went to him, moving with a curious, stiff gait, such as one might expect from an automaton. The creatures writhing on the floor went unheeded, even though he trod on them. "Stand still in front of the box." The man stood still. "Kneel down." The man did hesitate. There did seem to come to him some consciousness that he should himself be the originator of his own volition. There did come on to his distorted visage an agony of supplication which it was terrible to witness. The only result was an emphasized renewal of the command. "Kneel down upon the floor." And the man knelt down. His face was within a few inches of the painted box. As he knelt the stranger struck the box once more with the knuckles of his hand. And again there came from it that strange tumult of discordant sounds. "Quick, Andrew, quick, quick. Press your finger on the spring. Unfasten the box." The man did as he was bid. And, in an instant, like a conjurer's trick, the box fell all to pieces, and there sprang from it, right into Mr. Howitt's face, with a dreadful noise, some dreadful thing which enfolded his head in its hideous embraces. There was a silence. Then the stranger laughed. He called softly, "Andrew." All was still. Andrew. Again there was none that answered. The laughter was renewed. I do believe he's dead. I had always supposed that the stories about being able to frighten a man to death were all apocryphal. But that a man could be frightened to death by a thing like this, a toy. He touched the creature which concealed Mr. Howitt's head and face. As he said, it was a toy. A development of the old-fashioned jack-in-the-box. A dreadful development, and a dreadful toy. Made in the image of some creature of the squid class, painted in livid hues, provided with a dozen long, quivering tentacles, each actuated by a spring of its own. It was these tentacles which had enfolded Mr. Howitt's head in their embraces. As the stranger put them from him, Mr. Howitt's head fell, face foremost, onto the table. His partner, lifting it up, gazed down at him. Had the creature actually been what it was intended to represent, it could not have worked more summary execution. The look which was on the dead man's face as his partner turned it upwards was terrible to see.